Dr. Keisha Davis, Montgomery County's health officer and a Quince Orchard native, is also an author. Her book, The Making of a Pearl, tells the story of her grandmother, Ida Pearl Green. What inspired this book?
It's about my grandmother, who just turned 105 this past June, and so it's a blessing to still have her with us. And really, this is a collection of stories over her life. When I was in high school, her house was on the way to school, and I would stop at her house on my way to high school. And so a lot of the stories were gleaned at the breakfast table. About 10 years ago, she got really sick, and we were worried that we were going to lose her. And for years and years, me and my brother and other folks in my family had talked about, we need to write a book about my grandmother. And when she had gotten really sick, my brother said, this is the time, we've got to write it now. And so he started recording her and interviewing her. And in doing that, came up with a lot of stories about our community and turned that into a documentary called Finding Fellowship that really talks about the Quince Orchard community and how it has evolved over time and our family's history in that.
My name is Ida Pearl Green. I was born June 18, 1918.
And while she's a major character in that documentary, it still wasn't telling her story. And I really wanted to make sure that her story wasn't lost and put down on paper to be able to carry forward for my kids and future generations.
Then it's imperative for the people who know that history, it's imperative for the people who feel it's important to share, to reach out to the people who don't know.
What is her legacy here?
So she's a Montgomery County native. She grew up on Riffleford Road, which is right off of Route 28 in Darnestown, Maryland. When you ask her where she was born, she says she was born in Quince Orchard, Maryland. And so the history of Quince Orchard as a place, not just as a road or as a school, but really as a community. She was born right at the end of World War I. She's lived through World War II and Vietnam, but she's also lived through racial segregation, desegregation of churches and schools, changing community. And so the perspective that she has on how this area has changed, especially when you think about race and faith and community, I think is just a great testament and legacy to what we've seen.
Ida Pearl Green's great-grandparents, Gary and Matilda, who lived in the Quince Orchard community, were enslaved by the Higgins family. After emancipation, Gary Green and others purchased land and built a schoolhouse and a church.
And that was one of the first schoolhouses in Montgomery County for the education of colored children. That schoolhouse still stands today. The church still stands today. That schoolhouse was in operation until the 1940s. My grandparents and their parents before them attended that school, and that really was a center for the community in terms of, where folks could come together and express their faith, but also where they had fun times, where they watched movies, where they had parties, where they had baseball games.
Just keep living. That's my secret, just keep living.
During the pandemic, family members and the community came together to celebrate Green's birthdays with drive-by parades.
Keisha is her granddaughter, and she said that Pearl wanted for her birthday for people just to drive by and wave. And so she came up with this idea, and I think it's a marvelous idea.
A lot of folks ask, my grandmother, she turned 105, and they say, well, what's her secret? What's her secret? And if you ask her what her secret is, she'll say, just keep living. I would say that her secret is in a large part faith that she learned from her family and through some of the challenges that she went through. But I think it's also a strong sense of community.
How did your grandmother feel about you writing this book, and what was her reaction when she saw the product?
We had told my grandmother that we were writing this book for a really long time. The first conversations about the documentary were 10 years ago, and I had talked to her about writing a book even before that. So I don't think that she really believed me when I said that I was writing a book, when I said we were getting close to publishing it.
To understand my grandmother, you have to understand where she came from. She has a spirit of perseverance that is in her DNA, and was brought up with a faith that has carried her through many trials and tribulations.
And then on her birthday, at her drive-by, I presented her with the book. And I think in the excitement, she didn't really understand. But the next day I went, and she was just so tickled. She's like, I can't believe that this, and looking at herself on the cover and at the pictures inside. And she would say, well, how did you know all of this? Where'd you guys? I said, from talking to you. These are your stories.
Generations later, Dr. Davis is Montgomery County's health officer.
I think the other piece is working with community partners like identity.
I was interested in medicine from a young age, and I am a family physician, trained as a family physician, always passionate about community health, and started my career at a community health center in Columbia, Maryland. After my experience as a White House Fellow, I then helped to open a practice called Casey Health Institute that was in Gaithersburg, Maryland. And I'll just say, coming full circle, to know that my ancestors, my great-grandfather, just after the end of slavery, invested in this community by building a church and a schoolhouse, that is a legacy of generations. And to know that I now, 150 years later, get to come back and invest in that same community is just a legacy and an honor, I think, to be able to serve in that way.